Okay, hi everyone. Welcome. I'm about to introduce this session, Utilizing Your Unique Skill Set for Good. Marcus Daniell on founding a high-impact athlete. So the format here is a fireside chat. So we have the fire in the background. And I'll give a bit of a bio on who we have here today. So we have Grace, who's going to be interviewing Marcus. Grace is the head of marketing at Giving What We Can, and she has worked in marketing, digital product, and customer experience with various roles as a management consultant. Marcus is the founder and executive director of High Impact Athletes and has pledged 10% of his earnings to effective organisations for life. Marcus is a two-time Olympian and bronze medalist, a Wimbledon Australian Open quarterfinalist, and 5-time ATP Titleholder. We will be having a lot of questions directed to our two speakers here. But you can submit those via swap card, preferably. So if you go into the app and then open up the questions, little kind of chat box in the bottom, and we'll be monitoring those and sending those questions. So thanks everyone for being here, and I'll hand it over to you guys.
So to start off with, Marcus, I thought we'd chat a little bit about your background, how you became interested in effective altruism, and then maybe eventually what led you to start HA.
Yeah, sure. First, thanks everyone for coming. Appreciate you being here. I've been a tennis player my whole adult life. I started on the pro circuit when I was 17, and that's basically all I did with my time. And I did some study alongside that, but I was just full-time playing tennis. And a lot of people don't know this, but the early stages of professional tennis are pretty brutal on the bank account. You know, the expenses are huge and the prize money is tiny, so you're losing money every year. That was the reality for me for many years. And then when I got to a stage where I was starting to save a little bit of money at the end of each year, I got hit by this really powerful urge to try and give back in some way. I know there are a few athletes who have been at the elite level in the room. Sport is very selfish. It's necessarily selfish. You know, you're always trying to get the most out of yourself, and part of sport is beating everyone else. That never sat perfectly with me as who I wanted to be off the tennis court. So when I felt like I had this capacity to start giving back, I wanted to do something about it. Didn't feel like I knew how to go about that best. So, you know, like any good millennial, I jumped on Google and typed in something like how to give back best. I eventually came across 80,000 hours. And back then, 80,000 hours was very much focused on present-day suffering. And the two pillars that they spoke about that really resonated with me and with my tennis playing career were, one, earning to give. If I got better at tennis and moved up the ranks, I'd earn more, I could give more. And the second was advocacy, where if I got better at tennis, then naturally my profile should grow, and from that platform I can speak to more people. So yeah, it felt like a light bulb for me, you know, the effective altruism logo. And I started donating that year. I started the Try Giving pledge the following year and just built that percentage up over the years. And to the second part of the question, yeah, so this was sort of rolling on. I was giving. By 2020, I think at the start of that year, I pledged 8%, but sort of kept building it up. And then COVID hit and the tour stopped. And I had more time than I'd ever had in my adult life to really think about things. And I had this really painful realization, which was I'd at that stage been donating for, I want to say 5 or 6 years, but I'd never spoken about it. And, you know, being from Australia and I'm from New Zealand, we have tall poppy syndrome. So my reason was, I don't want to put myself out there publicly and have everyone just say, come on, pull your head in, all that sort of thing. But the second part of that painful realization was I had this huge opportunity cost where, because of my discomfort around speaking about this stuff, I'd missed 5 or 6 years of potential impact. And if by speaking about this stuff, I could have just got 10 other people to start on this journey that could have changed or saved lives. And so I realized my discomfort meant nothing in the face of that potential impact. And that was how High Impact Athletes was born. I have a pretty small profile in the scheme of things, but I have been lucky enough to meet athletes with, some of the biggest profiles in the world. And if these ideas were powerful for me, then could be powerful for these other athletes. And as a collective, we could maybe get these ideas out to hundreds of millions, potentially billions. So that was the start of Impact Athletes.
Amazing. I feel like that's like such a lovely story about growing your impact over time and then eventually founding this organization. Before we talk a little bit more about high impact athletes, I was wondering if you have always seen yourself as an altruistic person who wanted to give back, or whether this is something that you kind of developed over time.
I don't in my adult life, I don't think I considered myself to be particularly altruistic. My mum has a story. So I have an older brother and an older sister, and she has the story when I was 7 or 8 or something, and I got given a little bit of pocket money for my birthday, and my brother and sister convinced me to give it all away to them. So I think maybe I had some sort of maybe I was just gullible, but maybe I had some sort of altruistic lines in my body. But yeah, I never acted on it to any significant degree until I came across effective altruism, and yeah, so probably not, I guess, is the answer.
I don't know, I feel like giving all your pocket money away when you're a child maybe is a sign that you're more altruistic than you think.
Or a very convincing system.
Yeah, it's hard to know. So to go back a little bit to HIA and high impact athletes, what does high impact athletes actually do at the moment? What's the current strategy for the organization?
So we launched December 2020, and the whole concept was that I'd reach out to fellow athletes and basically explain the basic ideas of effective giving and say, hey, here are these charities that are recommended by the most stringent research organizations in the world. This is what I do with my money. I'd love if you join me. That has been successful. We've recruited at this point over 200 athletes, all representing at the international level across about 45 different sports in over 30 different countries. So the movement has grown pretty rapidly. And we've influenced at this point, I think a little over $800,000 towards high impact charities. And that's nice. And I think we can grow that. The growth curve at the moment is at the very start of being exponential. But where I think we actually have potential for the biggest impact is in our voice capacity. I think we're unique in the EA space in that already through our athletes, we have access to around 17 million eyeballs. And as we start recruiting bigger and bigger athletes, that number is really going to grow exponentially. And I think at the moment, the biggest weakness, personal opinion, of course, is EA is just so unknown on the wider scheme of things. And these ideas are so powerful, and especially for me, the basic ideas, if you're going to give effectively, that's so powerful that I want as many people in the world as possible to know that. And I think athletes are an incredible vehicle for that. So what we're sort of pivoting to in terms of strategy is we want to run discrete campaigns with specific fundraising targets for specific high impact charities with specific athletes, and try to have these real bite-sized stories that we can try and make go viral, and do a bunch of them simultaneously throughout the year, and then maybe 2 or 3 times a year try and do really large-scale campaigns. Like we have this idea that we're going to try and make happen either next year or the following, called Nothing But Nets, where there are a large number of NBA and Premier League athletes who have either first or second generation ties to really malaria-stricken countries in Africa, trying to get as many of them on board as possible around eradicating or preventing as much malaria as possible in those countries. And it's such a compelling story, and we've already had some success in scoping out campaigns when an athlete has an emotional tie to a place. So we're hoping that we can make something like that go truly global. And across those athletes in the NBA and Premier League, you're probably talking about between 500 million to 1 billion people who could see those campaigns, which is huge.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's incredible, and being from Giving What We Can, we're very much an outreach organization as well. So I think very much supportive of this, trying to get EA in front of many more people, especially on the effective giving front. So it sounds like you've shifted your strategy a little bit between 2020 and 2023. I guess, what lessons have you learned being an outreach org that have like led to this pivot that you're now undertaking?
I think the biggest lesson that we've learned that led to this change is people need stories to really be triggered into action. And it's not a very sexy story, perpetual giving. It's really hard to grab onto something infinite. If it's not time bounded, if it doesn't have a deadline or a shape that you can see, it's really hard to grab onto it. And that's what's led us to thinking, okay, we need to chunk these down. We need to have a story that we can tell with a goal and a start and an end. And so one guy who's come onto our board pretty recently, he had a very long and successful career in advertising. And something that stuck with me that he said was the best way to use voice is to talk about what you're doing, and what you're doing has to have that start, middle, end. So that's the learning that we're about to test in a big way. And my belief, our belief as an organization is that could have huge results. Although, you know, if we try a bunch of different campaigns and it doesn't work, then maybe we go back to the original model and just try and grow that as much as we can.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear about like experiences you've had with, I guess, like trying to change someone's behavior, like the conversations that you're having with an athlete to say like, hey, I think you should get on board with this. Like, what does that look like and what have you learned?
So generally, I try to make the ideas as accessible as possible. One, because athletes are not known as being the most academic of demographics. And two, because and two, because actually a lot of athletes I speak to are speaking English as a second language. And so we do need to make the ideas as accessible as possible. The thing that really resonates with athletes, and where I think there's a beautiful crossover, is athletes are completely laser focused on optimization. Because they have to be, because everyone else in their sport is. So if they're not optimizing, they get left behind. So this way of approaching their training, their recovery, you know, their bodies, their sport, I feel like what effective altruism is that framework applied to charity. So I think there's just sort of like almost like a subconscious understanding. It's just the high performance mindset applied to charity. So I think there's beautiful crossover there. And it's honestly been incredibly surprising how successful it's been in speaking to athletes, where if I get into the position where I'm in a one-on-one phone call with an athlete, about 7 out of 10 athletes end up joining high impact athletes and taking action with this stuff, which some people in the charity space have told me is outrageous in terms of conversion rate. So that's really cool. I imagine as we sort of start exhausting our personal networks or like friends of friends networks, that number will probably drop. But the other unique advantage we have here is that, you know, I've been a professional athlete for 16 years or whatever, and our managing director, he's been a professional athlete for 15, 16 years. Kev, they're a professional athlete for a long time as well. So, you know, we have this unique capacity to open doors that might otherwise be really difficult to open.
And do you think that like your history as a professional athlete is the reason that you're getting so many people on board, or do you think there are other factors that are like really helping these athletes get on board?
I think it's almost a prerequisite that I or someone in the organization has been a credible athlete just to open the door. And then when the doors open, I think the ideas start to speak for themselves. But then the other thing that I think is really important is I've been on this journey for many years. You know, I have taken the Giving What We Can pledge. I stick to my word, and there are only a handful of other people in high impact athletes who have taken that level of pledge. So it's like, I can say, hey, I'm doing this, it feels really good for me. You do what's comfortable for you, but just know that this is a nice and good thing to do, and it gives back. Like, you know, it sounds sort of cliche, and I'm sure everyone in the room can identify with this, but the amount that I give I feel like I get a lot more back in return from the world and just from the feelings that it generates for me. So being able to say that, I think, is pretty powerful for these athletes too. Often, a lot of these athletes have never given to charity before they started talking to us.
Yeah, of course. I think that makes a lot of sense. One thing I'd be interested in that I guess links to the title of the talk or the chat is around your unique skill set. How do you think that being a professional athlete has prepared you to run an outreach org?
Well, I love that question.
We didn't prepare for it, but seems like a good lead given the title.
So there's one thing that actually I think was amazing preparation, which is learning how to deal with failure. So in tennis in particular, I might play between 30 to 35 tournaments a year. And it's, I've won, in the bio it says I've won 5 ATP titles in my life, and I've played at that level for 8 years. So that means less than 1 title per year, which means that almost every week I'm failing. And in tennis, if you can't deal with that failure, learn from it and move on, you can't survive onto it. And in an outreach org, there's a lot of failure. There's a lot of no's, there's a lot of doors that just don't open or that, get closed in front of you. So I think that part of the skill set that you learn as a pro athlete has been immensely valuable for running HIA.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think that's something that I personally am always trying to get better at. Maybe if I played more sport growing up, I'd be more resilient. But right now, I feel like it's still something I'm working on. Maybe it's a reason to take out tennis. My mom would be proud of me. Okay. Before we move on to some questions from the audience, I guess another question for me is around, I guess, what advice might you have for people who are doing outreach now or who are interested in pursuing outreach?
It's probably a controversial take. I think effective altruism shoots itself in the foot a little bit with how inaccessible it makes itself, with the language that it uses, and to some degree with the ideas that it tries to push. I think behavior change is really hard, and getting people in the door is the first step that we should be aiming for, rather than a full, hey, you want to do good in the world, here's a treatise on AI safety type thing. So High Impact Athletes focuses on global health and poverty, animal welfare, climate change, because these are things that people have heard before, and because people probably won't turn around and walk in the other direction when we start talking about that stuff with them. And in my mind, it's start there, and if they go deeper, and as they sort of get more interested in this stuff, take more and more steps, then you can start introducing the more complex and intellectual ideas of EA. So yeah, I think my take on that would be start basic, try and get people in the door, and then go more complex.
So I have a related question here in the Q&A, kind of about, someone asked, you mentioned tall poppy syndrome is being really present in Australia and New Zealand, and advice you might have for how we might be able to combat this when we're talking about giving, or ways to feel more comfortable with talking about giving.
That's a really tricky one for me, because it took me so long to realize that that's what was holding me back. So I don't feel like I have a silver bullet for it. I guess my only advice would be realize that your discomfort is just your discomfort. And 2 things. First, it's nice for personal growth to push through discomfort and do something. And 2, if you let that stop you talking about this stuff, then that's also an opportunity cost in terms of impact. So just, if you're rationally minded or logically minded, weigh that equation in your mind, and is it worth it?
Yeah, I think it's a reflection to share from my own experience is I think that it gets easier with practice, right? So often you feel really nervous about advocating if you've never done it before, but it gets easier over time. And now I'm lucky because I also work for an outreach org, but it has become a lot easier for me to talk about my own giving over time, just because I've had a lot of practice now. And I think that makes a really big difference, is just to be more comfortable. Also, be comfortable if people maybe are a little bit weird about it, or do kind of have this tall poppy reaction. I think feeling really confident also that what you're doing is genuinely good, and that this is not something you should feel bad about. What you're doing is altruistic and helping others, and there's no reason that anyone should make you feel bad about that. This is very much coming from them, not from you, even if it feels bad. I think having that self-confidence that the actions that you took are genuinely positive really helps me kind of push through any discomfort.
Yeah, I like that. And I think also, I think everyone at this conference is doing it for good reasons. So, maybe if you were only doing it because you wanted to post on Instagram that you gave that money, maybe that's something you should feel a bit of talk about. I don't know. But if you're doing it for good reasons, then it's not something anyone should be ashamed of, in my mind.
Yeah, I totally agree. So we have a question here about, what are the challenges of trying to talk to top tier athletes about giving, especially in tennis, which is incredibly top loaded in terms of earnings?
Yeah, there are a few things that popped up in my mind there. The first challenge is getting in front of them. The bigger the athlete, the more layers of defense they have around them. And agents hate us because we're asking athletes for things, and agents get paid with how much money they bring to the athlete, and 10% of zero is zero. So it's hard to get access to the biggest athletes. Sorry, just repeat the question again.
So the challenges of trying to talk to these athletes, especially in tennis, where the earnings are kind of heavy-tailed in one direction.
Yeah, okay, so there were two things, and I might have to ask you to repeat that question again after the first thing I say, but another thing that we have to combat is the scarcity mindset, where sport is a weird thing. You could break your leg tomorrow and you're done, and your livelihood is gone, and no one knows when or if that's going to happen. The average career length for the big US team sports is 3, 4, 5 years. So athletes have this mindset of, I have to make hay while the sun shines, and I don't know when it's going to stop. It's hard to weasel your way into that and say, yes, but give while you're doing it. That is something that we have to fight against. And then the question about tennis, one really interesting thing we've seen is it's actually not the athletes who earn the most money who give the most. And that's true in percentage terms, and it's also true in dollar terms, which is crazy. I'm not sure I should be saying this publicly, but I'm going to because I think it's funny. Internally, we have we've segmented our athletes into sort of categories based on how many followers they have on social media, so how many eyeballs they can get in front of, plus estimated earnings per year. And the section that we call snappers, which are a lovely fish, everyone likes them, but they're not blue whales, they're not super majestic. They're people with between 10 to 50,000 followers who we think earn less than $250,000 a year. They're the most generous out of all of them. They're more generous than the people on our books who are earning 20 million a year, which to me is super interesting, because you'd think the people earning 20 million, throw 100 grand at charity, doesn't really mean anything to them. So in terms of the top loaded question, something that we're sort of experimenting with is, should we actually not be going for the absolute superstars? Should we be going for the journeymen who are still doing pretty well for themselves, but don't have either the layers of defense or perhaps the inflated ego or the feeling of another person wants another thing from me that the superstars have. Still trying to figure that out, but yeah, it's an interesting little dynamic.
Yeah, that's really interesting. For, I guess, like the broader philanthropy sector, there's a concept of this U-shaped curve in terms of giving, where people who have the lowest incomes give a significant portion of their income. In the US, I think it's people in the lowest income bracket give around 13% of their income. So a really significant amount if you're up around the poverty line. And then that really drops down when people are earning, you know, they're not super wealthy, but you know, they're in this kind of like top 1-2%. So like you maybe 80K to 300, 400K a year, which is still like most people are at the top of that end are like quite wealthy. But then it goes like way up again. For those who are ultra wealthy, they often start to give more. But people who are in this kind of like white collar jobs often are giving the least, which is quite interesting because we think of these people as like, these are mostly people like us in the room. They're often giving the least if we look at the broader philanthropy sector.
Do you know how that correlates to age as well?
Great question. No, I can find out. I guess I can look at some like reports and get back to you. But this concept of the U-shaped curve is like pretty common in philanthropy.
Because I wonder if it's this similar but different as like the athlete scarcity mindset. Don't know how long the career is going to last. Like in your 20s, 30s, 40s, you're head down grinding, trying to set up the nest egg, and then you feel secure. Or I don't know. Forgive my brain fart.
I have some theories about this, which I can quickly expand on, is that I think that the people who are in these bottom income brackets are often the beneficiaries of charity as well. So they can see in their communities, they can see that the people around them really need help. Like, you know, their friends and family aren't doing well. So giving means that they're helping their community. And then I think that around a lot of white collar people, like, they're like not convinced that they're that well off. They're like trying to get to be wealthy. They're like, I need all of my money so that I can get to that next level, and kind of like trying to like buy some financial security in their minds. But I think that they could be giving much more than they are. But that's my kind of theory about why we see some of that. And then obviously very rich people just have the money. And feel much secure. So next question. You said that you feel like your giving gives a lot back to you. What has surprised you about how it feels to give? And what seems to resonate with other athletes?
I guess one thing that has surprised me about giving is one of the biggest bits of pushback we get from athletes when we're talking to them about what we do is they want to give back to their local community, you know, like the animal shelter down the road and stuff. Also, to a large degree, athletes feel like they owe their community a lot because it's only through the help of their community that they've got to where they are. It's fully understandable. I think something that's surprised me is, you know, all of my donations go to charities that don't work anywhere near where I live. And I don't feel like that has lessened the warm fuzzies that I feel about it. And I would have expected it to feel a little more cold. But so one thing that we do at HIA is at the end of each year, we generate an impact report for everyone based on best guess estimates of where their money went and how much and what we think that might have resulted in terms of real world impact. And seeing those reports, like seeing my personal report and then also seeing the report for HIA as a whole, that's really cool. You know, and when you think about those actual numbers and think about the individuals that comprise those numbers, I love it. Like it's worth more than what I give. And yeah, again, something that's probably old news to everyone here, like we are so lucky, and being able to acknowledge that luck and that privilege and then do something from it and then see the stats around what's happening from that. I don't know, I just find it beautiful.
And yeah, it sounds like that hasn't lessened at all over time. Like you probably felt this way when you first started giving effectively, and you feel just as strongly about it now.
Yeah, and actually, one thing I want to mention there that the first year that I discovered EA, I made a one-off donation to the Against Malaria Foundation, I think, and it felt great, but I sort of forgot about it a few days later. As soon as I made a pledge, and I started at 1%, but as soon as I made that pledge, it actually changed the way I felt about my career, where in tennis, you earn money by winning. Like you don't have a salary. So if you get injured in February, you're buggered, basically. Like you don't earn money that year. But the pledge meant that every match that I won was great for me. And you know, I'm not gonna try and bullshit you guys and say that was, you know, like that was my primary driver. I wanted to be a better tennis player. I wanted to improve my career. I was very ambitious, blah, blah, blah. But having this pledge meant that a small amount of everything I won every time I went through a tournament went for something so much bigger than myself. And that actually really landed with me, and it gave me such a deeper meaning in all of the hard times of sport, because sport takes you to the 10 out of 10s and the 1 out of 10s week to week. Like it's such a roller coaster. And there are so many days where you don't want to go on court, you don't want to go in the gym, but having something where it's like, well, if I win another match, then, you know, maybe like 100 kids are going to have a better life. That's a pretty amazing booster to like, yes, I'm going to go out and get in the gym or like go on the court for another hour. So yeah, I think having the pledge and having it actually play a part in your day-to-day life, for me, has been hugely meaningful. And I've heard that echoed from a lot of athletes who've taken the pledge as well. At HIA, we have anchored lower, so our HIA pledge is 2% or more. But yeah, a lot of the athletes who have taken that pledge have said like it's a cool part of their lives and not a drain. And actually, I just remembered the thing that I really liked about your Q&A session.
Oh, great. We were talking about this before.
I can't remember which of you it was who said a lot of people would probably take a job that paid 90% as much if it meant that they had a huge impact on the world or that it was meaningful for them. I love that frame, and I'm going to steal it. Because I think framing it that way is like it's framing not the lack, it's framing the abundance. And yeah, I think just the pledge I think is a beautiful tool, especially in sports that are lumpy or where you have an uncertain income, because it goes up and down with your performance. So if you have a bad year or if you get injured, you're not squeezed more than you otherwise need to be.
Yeah, someone on our team has suggested that we rename the Giving What We Can pledge to Keep 90%. Rather than giving 10%, you get to keep 90% what you earn. Lucky you. Yeah, I think that's an interesting framing, because I guarantee the next sentence someone would say is, but the government paid for 90%. So you're actually only keeping 50, but you know, let's ignore those people. So keep 90%. Maybe this is something you can change for. Exactly, it's becoming a really long name. So another question here is around what is the process of actually reaching out to these athletes? How are you, like, who are you choosing to reach out to, and how do you get in contact with them?
So usually it's either me or Hugo, and two ways we try to do it. The best way to do it is either if they're somehow in our personal network. I think we've come reasonably close to exhausting that now. The second best way is to have an intro from people who are in our personal network, like a warm introduction. Beyond that, it's the smash your face against the wall of cold outreach, LinkedIn, Instagram messages. I never paid attention to social media during my career, which I'm now lamenting, because actually having a big profile on social media sort of gives you credibility if you drop into someone's DMs. So I'm now posting a story a day to try to increase my Instagram following, so that I can, so that if I slide into someone's DMs, and they look at my profile, they're like, oh, he might actually be legitimate. But yeah, so it's we try to get the warm intros, and if that fails, you know, we're just like knocking on doors, basically.
Okay, how's your Instagram journey going?
It's been wild. So Cam told me probably about 4 months ago to start posting a story a day to trick the algorithm, and I started doing it with whatever was in my camera roll, and I started getting like 100+ followers a day, but I think the majority of them are Brazilian bots. But you know, I've more than doubled my count, and if that's what matters for people who are saying, is this person legitimate or not, then who cares? Like, I welcome the bots.
Like pro bot.
I mean, maybe Cam without me knowing.
Okay, that sounds great. A new high impact strategy is buying followers. I'm glad that that's what we've said a lot today in this conference. That's a wonderful outcome.
That is my main story theme. Yeah.
One thing we actually haven't talked about yet is maybe some of the high profile athletes that are actually part of the organization. Is there anyone that anyone like might know in the room that is associated with high impact athletes?
I hope so. It would be great if the answer is yes. So probably our highest profile athlete is a guy called Stefanos Tsitsipas. Have people heard of him?
Yes.
Great. He's, I think, the 5 tennis player in the world. We've just recently, so because my network is tennis, we're pretty tennis heavy. And actually it sort of goes back to talking about campaigns and relevant campaigns. So this is very recent, but something to look out for because I think it's really cool. A guy called Felix Auger-Aliassime, who is a phenomenal young Black Canadian tennis player, super articulate, like amazing role model. I spoke to him and his agent last year about joining HIA. Felix was keen, agent wasn't. Classic example of the agent shooting something down. But I went back to him last week because he has Togolese heritage, and Malaria Consortium has huge programs in Togo. So the idea was take a really relevant idea to an athlete who has an emotional attachment to that place and see what happens. So I went with the stats of Malaria Consortium to him. We had a great conversation, and long story short, he's in for a campaign next year using his profile and some of his own funds to try and get more medicine for malaria prevention in Togo. And to me, a profile like his and a cause like that, if HIA can do a good enough job along with Malaria Consortium of creating content around that, it's the sort of thing that ideally, and I hope a ton of people in Canada will get behind because it just makes so much sense. So yeah, we're going to try and do that with more high profile athletes. So those are a couple of tennis names. Cool results at the US Open recently. The women's doubles champions, both of them high impact athletes. One of them a 2% pledger and the other a donor. Actually, one of them is one of our staff at HIA. She helps with social media. Men's doubles champions, one of them's a 2% pledger, the other one's a donor. And men's singles finalist, Daniel Medvedev, his coach is part of HIA as well. So, but the real honeypot for this is US team sports, because they're insanely well paid. US is per capita the most generous country in the world, and the recognition and the following that they get over there is just massive. So we have 1 or 2 athletes across those sports, but we need to really try and make a push in there, because especially at the NBA, the median salary is many millions of dollars a year, and they're just followed so widely. So yeah, hopefully over the next year or so, we can recruit a lot more athletes from those sports.
Yeah, so following up on recruiting athletes, is there a plan to target these promising up-and-coming athletes before they become hard to reach? Is this part of your strategy, is like finding these rising stars?
It's a really good question, and the answer is no, and I think there's a really good reason for that. So all of the biggest sports brands in the world spend many, many millions of dollars a year trying to identify those people. Like, scouting is hard, and anything can stop a career. Like I was speaking earlier about injury. Injury can stop a career of someone who might have the most talent and potential in the world when they're 17. So one idea is that we try and partner with some of those huge sport brands and say, hey, if you've got people who are up and coming, then we'd love to just have a chat with them and say, hey, here are your options about charity. Here's why we think high impact charity makes sense. Even if you set up your own foundation under your own name, you can still donate to high impact charities. And one, I guess, sort of side door that we're thinking about with that is, in tennis, if you reach a certain ranking, then you have to go through something called ATP University. And that's like an educational series. It used to be a couple of days in person, a couple of times a year, where you learn about media training, all the people who are going to gamble on you and send you death threats, how to deal with that, like all this sort of stuff. And they're keen on the idea of me showing up to those ATP universities and educating athletes on what their options are around charity. So, I'll try to deliver that in a reasonably unbiased way, but I think the options are partner with charities directly. Hard to know which charities are really good and which aren't. Start your own foundation with your cousin who you trust. Really expensive. Also, where do you direct your money? Really hard to know where. Or partner with someone like HIA, where you join a community of 200 plus athletes who are doing this as well, and we can help you find the most impactful charities. So I'm hoping that sort of side door, and if we take that presentation, show a case study of it, of people appreciating it in tennis, and take it to like the NBA Player Association or the NFL Player Association, then we can start just sort of getting in people's brain spaces early on, and maybe later when they've earned millions of dollars, they're like, I remember this thing, that sounds sort of interesting, and they get in touch with us. It's very much just an idea at this stage, but I think it has some potential.
Yeah, I think that sounds potentially very impactful. I know that one thing that Luke always talks about is how a lot of his kind of advocacy efforts have really paid off down the line, and how many years later people come back and say like, oh yeah, you're that guy that does high impact charity. Like, tell me about it. Like, I now want to know. So I think that the doing that kind of work would be very impactful. So to think more back on the psychology of giving, do you think that the psychology of giving changes for athletes who earn by winning, like tennis, or are contract based? So like, where people's like income is either like, maybe lumpy or inconsistent versus a consistent income over time. And have you noticed a difference in the way those athletes react?
The honest answer is I don't think we know yet, because most of our athletes are either earning lumpily or their contracts are very small. And so if contracts, like most Olympic athletes aren't rich. They are earning a living wage through their national federation, maybe supplement, like a lot of Olympic athletes have to supplement on the side with jobs. And almost all of our high earning athletes are based on wins, or like we have a couple of boxers, one of whom was a former heavyweight world champion, still like a couple of times a year, very lumpy. I'd love to know the answer to that question when we recruit more highly paid contract-based athletes. I would hope that then we could say, go to them and say 2% of your most recent contract is this per month. Does this feel comfortable for you? Does 10% feel comfortable for you? And it's like a set and forget. That would be ideal, because not only would it mean, based on studies, more dollars donated over their lifetime, but also for us, it's just less work than at the end of each year going to athletes and saying, hey, I see that you've earned this much per year, because a lot of like in tennis, everything's public in that regard. This is what the percentage is, still up for it. Like, we do a lot of chasing in that regard. So yeah, I think the best ROI for us is working with contracted athletes on a set and forget basis.
Yeah, one other random question that just popped into my head is, so a lot of athletes might be receiving sponsorships from brands as a part of their income. And I know that HIA typically looks at like a percentage of winnings, right? Are people looking at pledging some of their income from their sponsorships? Because I imagine that for some athletes, this makes up a sizable amount of what they're actually earning.
I don't think so. So I know one where we've spoken very explicitly about it is one tennis player who I think on average probably earns around $1 million a year from his prize money. He made the decision to pledge 2% of his prize money without including endorsements. But talking about top heaviness, I estimate he'd earn 50 to 150 grand from sponsorships. Whereas, you know, the likes of Roger Federer or Rafa Nadal, they might earn 10 mil a year in prize money, but their sponsorships are sort of 50, 60, 70, 80 mil. So I don't think that's super relevant unless you're talking to the superstars.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes total sense. And this obviously shows my ignorance for like how sponsorships are calculated in sports. So do you think that high net worth athletes who are inclined to give maybe have their own foundation? So do we think, yeah, there's a portion of people that maybe have their own foundation set up already and are going to be just much less open to something like high impact athletes? How have you navigated, I guess, like different structures around giving?
Yeah, so in general, the ones who have their own foundations set up are less open to this stuff, but we have 2 athletes who have their own foundations who through their foundations have donated to one or more of our charities, which is great. I've been lucky enough to have a relationship with some of the big tennis names and have asked them about this stuff, like the Federers and the Nadals. And when they get to that size, the answer inevitably is, I actually don't take care of that. They've got teams of 20 people who are running their foundations, and they're basically hands off, except for when they fly to Africa to play an exhibition tennis match and raise a ton of money. So we probably need to be getting athletes on board before they reach superstar status and have their own foundations that have a charter that they have to hold themselves to. But with some foundations, it seems like there's a little bit of wiggle room in there.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think it can be often really hard to reach people that have foundations or even like who have agents, right? And they don't, like, people have an interest in people keeping their money or like using their money in a specific way makes it quite hard to influence.
And sorry, just one more point on that. Like, when you're dealing with public figures who have their own foundations and have public recognition for what their foundations are doing, there's some cost in that, and they're known for that in their communities. So there's actually risk for them in saying, no, we're not going to help this community project anymore because we're going to do this instead. Like, I imagine there'd be a fair amount of local backlash, which would feel horrible for them. So I sort of understand why they're less open to it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's something that we have found difficult sometimes with donors. As we kind of like are rounding out the session here, I'd love to hear a little bit about your personal giving and what charities like you're currently donating to, or like, yeah, which charities or organizations you're really passionate about.
So I mentioned my first donation was to Against Malaria Foundation. I think for the first 2 or 3 years, I donated to global health and poverty charities. And then I was living with my brother and his family in DC for a while, and I was listening to an 80,000 Hours podcast with a guy called Lewis Bollard, who heads up Open Phil's animal welfare program. And I thought the podcast was amazing, and I was ranting about it to my brother, saying like, hey, listen to all these ideas. Also, the guy sounded sort of Kiwi, and he was like, oh, what was his name? He was like, he's Lewis Bollard. And my brother was like, oh yeah, he lives around the corner. I sometimes walk his dog on a Saturday, which is such a New Zealand thing. It turns out our families know each other. So my brother introduced me to Lewis, and Lewis sent me a bunch of material about factory farm animal welfare, and why its neglectedness was so high, and why perhaps as a small donor myself, I'd make more marginal impact there. And it made a huge amount of sense to me. So since then, I've allocated, I'd say probably 80% of my personal donations between Good Food Institute and the Humane League, with actually the rest, I'm trying to leverage it by doing things like if athletes run a small campaign for something for one of our charities, I'll say like I'll match up to X amount. So trying to sort of incentivize other people to donate more because I'll say I'll match that. So yeah, mainly fund animal welfare, which actually, just as a bit of context for me, I grew up on a sheep and beef farm in New Zealand, so I know what I think of as good farming, like what that looks like and how animals are treated. And for me, that actually makes it even more horrible seeing the way that animals are treated in factory farms. So I'm extremely passionate about that, although it has led to some interesting conversations with my father. But yeah, that's my big passion.
I also come from a farming family, and there's been some incredible conversations as well, including my grandfather saying, "Why are you doing this to us?" Which was uncomfortable to say the least. Okay, one final question before we wrap up. The most highly voted question for Q&A. How fast can you bed?
I think I actually don't know exactly, but it's in the realms of like 210 to 215 kilometers now.
I'm impressed.
So to put it in context,
You could have said nothing.
I think the fastest ever clocked was 247, 249 by actually Sam Groff, who is now an MP or something in Victoria.
Yeah,
It's like a politician here. He's a beast, big dude. And the big servers would consistently be hitting 220 around there. So I wouldn't often hit that speed, but once in a while, try and break my shoulder off and go for it.
All right.
Question.
I want to thank you so much, Marcus, for talking today, but also for your work at High Impact Athletes. I'm really excited about the org, and it's been great to chat to you. And thank you, everyone, for attending.